The smell was the first thing they held against her. That whole August, Bridget Doyle walked the draws east of the creek with a grain sack and a three-tine fork, and she came home every evening carrying the one thing the rest of that road stepped around: dried cow chips. She laid them out behind the house in long gray rows, the way another woman might stack cordwood, and she laid them where the road could see. Nobody out there had timber to spare. Everybody knew it. But there's knowing a thing, and there's bending down for it with your own hands, and most of the county had decided the bending was beneath them. They bought their coal off the railroad like decent folks. They let the widow gather her muck in the sun and said what they said. Amos Reed said it loudest. He sold that coal, and he watched her pass his store one evening with a full sack on her shoulder, and he said, plenty loud enough to carry, that a woman who'd burned filth in her stove would feed her children out of the same hand she gathered it with. Bridget didn't turn around. She'd quit turning around a while back. Here's the thing nobody on that road saw coming. This is the story of the winter the coal trains stopped cold, and the one stove on that whole stretch that never went out. By February, the people holding their noses would be standing at her door with their hands held out to it, and not one of them would quite know how to say thank you for it. Stick with it to the end. There's a question about that winter the county never did answer, and it waits till the last of it. If you follow the channel, you won't miss the next one. Bridget had buried her husband in the spring of '79. Not an accident. The slow kind of dying. The kind that gives you a week to watch it come and no way to wave it off. He left her the claim, 3 children, and a cast-iron stove that ate more than she could ever feed it. That first winter alone did her arithmetic for her. Coal cost money she was already short of. Worse, it came on a train she had no say over. She spent one January counting lumps into the stove like a miser counting coins, and somewhere in that cold, she made herself a promise. She would not spend another winter with her family's warmth sitting in another man's ledger. So come summer, she did the thing the old prairie women had always done, and the thing the new families found disgusting. She gathered chips. Burning dried dung was no secret out there. Half the plains ran on it. They even had a name for it: prairie coal. And a good chip, cured hard in the sun, burned near smokeless and didn't stink the way the town people swore it did. Most of the ones who sneered had never once tried it. Bridget had grown up on it, back before her own family got the notion they'd climbed above it. Her mother had a line she used to say. Bridget gave it to Nell one evening, the two of them packing chips into the lean-to. "The prairie'll heat you for nothing, girl, if you're not too proud to stoop." Nell was 6 that year, and small for it, with a chest that whistled when the cold got into it. That was the part Bridget kept to herself. For most families, a cold house was a hardship. In hers, it was the thing that sat up nights, listening to a child breathe. The Harts came onto the next quarter that fall. Lavinia Hart was from back east, Ohio, people said, and she'd married out onto the plains with a trunk of good dresses and no notion of what she'd come to. She kept a clean parlor and a straight back. She'd learned the words prairie coal as a joke before she'd learned what they were for. She and Bridget would have their reckoning before the spring. Not yet, though. That October, the almanac promised an easy winter. There were old men who said otherwise, who watched the muskrats pile their houses high on the bank and the cattle grow their coats too thick too early. But nobody prints what an old man feels in his knees. The almanac was wrong by about 5 months. You didn't just grab a chip off the ground and drop it in the stove. There was a craft to it, and the sneering families never learned it because they never had to. A fresh pat was no good. Wet, heavy, it'd smoke and hiss and choke the fire out. What you wanted were the ones that had sat through weeks of sun and wind till they'd gone light and pale and hard as a roof shingle. Bridget could read a good one with the toe of her boot before she ever bent for it. Flip it. Check the underside was dry clear through, and only then it went in the sack. She worked that summer like a harvest, because that's what it was. Early mornings, before the heat came down, she took Tom and Michael out to the draws where the cattle had sheltered and the chips lay thickest. Tom was 12 and thought it was beneath him for about a week. One morning he said it out loud. "The Hanson boys don't have to do this." Bridget didn't stop working. "The Hanson boys buy coal. So why don't we buy coal?" She straightened up then and looked at him a second, deciding how much to say to a 12-year-old. "Because the year we can't," she said, "I want to be the family that doesn't notice." Tom didn't have an answer for that. He went back to the sack. After that, he quit complaining where she could hear. A chip burns fast. That's the catch nobody warns you about. You feed a chip stove 3-4 times as often as a coal one. The heat's honest, but it doesn't linger. So it took a startling pile to lay by a winter. Bridget counted it in sack loads, and she figured she needed the lean-to packed to the rafters and then a good deal more. She kept the children at it into September, past the point their arms went dead, past the point Lavinia Hart took to watching over the fence with her mouth folded up tight. "You'd do well to lay some by yourself," Bridget told her once. Wasn't unkind about it. Lavinia said she'd sooner freeze than paw through a pasture like a field hand. Bridget let it go. She remembered the words, though. "You do." Amos Reed found the whole business funnier the more she gathered. She came into the store in August for salt and thread, and he leaned on the counter and asked her, in front of 2 other men, how the muck harvest was coming. "Slow," she said. "There's a lot of it." One of the men laughed. Amos didn't quite. "You know I'll sell you coal on credit, Bridget, same as anybody." "I know you will," she said, "at your price, on your train." She counted out her coins for the salt and left the thread. Amos told the men, after the door shut, that the widow was building herself a monument to muck. Then he sold them their coal, took their money, marked it in the book. He had a good stock laid in and a railroad standing behind it, and not one reason on God's earth to think either one would fail him. The first snow came on the 12th of October, 3 weeks early. It didn't melt. That October snow was just the front door swinging open. After it, the storms came in a line, one behind the next, close enough that folks lost track of where one quit and another started. The railroad was the whole reason those towns sat where they sat, so the railroad fought the hardest. Crews dug the cuts out by hand, and the wind packed them back in behind the men faster than they could throw it. Sometime after the new year, the company quit pretending. No coal train was reaching that county again before spring. These weren't people with a shed full of prairie coal. These were modern families. They bought fuel by the ton and trusted the train to bring the next ton. When the train quit, the counting started. Full lumps in the bin, then half lumps, then the black dust in the bottom, swept up and burned with the splinters off the coal shed floor. Amos Reed sold the last of his stock in the second week of January. He did not sell it cheap. The man who'd called Bridget's Rose a monument to muck stood behind his counter and charged 3 prices for the scrapings, till there was nothing left to charge for. Then he shut the store and went home to a house he couldn't keep warm either. By late January, the talk on that road had stopped being about the cold. It had turned to who still had something left to burn. You can tell a killing winter, years later, by the fences. When the coal ran out, people burned what they had, and the fences went first. A fence rail is dry, it's split small, it's right there in the yard. Whole sections came down in a night. To this day, out on that kind of ground, you'll find an old line of posts with the rails gone, and no one left who remembers why. After the fences, the houses started giving up their own wood. A family down the road pulled the slats out from under the beds and slept on the floor by the stove, all of them in the one room. Somebody burned a good pine dresser their grandmother had carried west. Green cottonwood, cut that same week, that spat and steamed and wouldn't take a flame. hay twisted into hard, tight knots. That gave a few minutes of heat and took the barn's own feed to do it, which is a thing you pay for twice. Twisted hay was so common that winter they made a tool for it later, a wooden gadget to wind the knots tight and fast. But hay burns like paper. A man could sit and twist all evening and feed it to the stove near as quick as he made it. And out at the Doyle place, twice a day, the widow walked to her lean-to, filled a basket with gray chips that smelled of next to nothing, and kept one room warm enough that a child with a bad chest could sleep in it. She wasn't counting her own pile yet. She was watching the smoke off the other chimneys, thinner every day, house by house. She knew exactly what thin smoke meant. Nell took sick the last week of January. It started the way it always started with her, a whistle down in the breath, a cough that wouldn't clear. But this time, the house couldn't get warm enough to fight it, because Bridget was already stretching the lean-to to feed more stoves than her own. The child wanted heat more than anything. A warm room, steady, night and day. And heat was the one thing that winter had decided to ration hardest of all. There was a night in there Bridget never talked about after. The fire had to stay up till morning, and staying up meant feeding it every little while, because prairie coal won't bank down and hold a bed of coals the patient way hard coal will. So she didn't sleep. She sat by the stove door and fed it, chip after chip, through the whole black middle of the night, listening to the whistle come and go in the back room. Around 2, Nell woke up enough to talk. "Mama, it smells like the pasture." Bridget said it did. "Is that bad?" the girl asked. "No," Bridget told her. "That's the smell of you being warm. Go back to sleep." And the child did, and that was the last easy word said in that house for a while. Somewhere in the small hours, Bridget added up what was left in the lean-to, and she didn't care for the answer. Because she had enough. That was the truth of it. She had enough to see her own 3 through, if she was careful, but not enough to keep half the road burning and hold a sick room warm around the clock on top of it. One or the other, not both. The knock was coming. She could feel it coming the way you feel weather. The only question left was what she'd have in the lean-to when she opened the door. Somewhere before dawn, she made a choice she could never quite explain to anybody after. She kept the fire high for the child, and she decided she'd keep filling the neighbors' baskets besides, and let the bottom of the pile come when it came. It was not a sensible thing to do. She knew that while she was deciding it. She decided it anyway. By morning, the fever had eased off enough for Nell to take a little broth. The lean-to was lower than Bridget had ever once let it get in January, with the hard back half of the winter still ahead of her. And that same morning, somebody knocked. What it cost her to open that door with the pile already low is the rest of this. If you're still with her, stay for it. It was Lavinia Hart on the step. The woman who'd said she'd sooner freeze stood at Bridget's door with a basket over her arm, and frost worked into the wool of a coat that had been fine 2 winters back. She didn't come out with it right away. Talked about the storm a minute. Then she ran clean out of storm to talk about. "My husband's burning the last of the fence," she said finally, "and the baby's hands were cold this morning. In his own house, in his own crib, his hands were cold." She looked past Bridget at the gray rose just inside the lean-to door. The filth she'd named to the widow's own face. And there was nowhere left on her to put the pride. "I don't know how a person even asks for this." Here was the moment, if Bridget had wanted it. She could have handed the words right back. Sooner freeze than paw through a pasture. She could have shut the door and stayed warm and stayed right all the way to spring. What she did was step back and hold the door. "Bring the basket in," she said, "and send your oldest boy over in the morning. If your family's going to burn out of my shed, your family's going to help me fill it. I'm not the coal company." That was the whole of it. Not a word about who'd been right. She filled the basket out of the gray rose and sent Lavinia Hart home to a warm morning. Lavinia wasn't the last. Word runs through a snowed-in county quiet and quick at the same time. The Peterson boy came the next night, sent by his father, who was too proud to come himself and not too proud to send a 14-year-old out in it. He stood on the step with a flour sack and wouldn't step in. "Pa says he'll pay you back in oats come the thaw," the boy said. Bridget looked at him a second. "Tell your pa I don't want oats. Tell him you're to come Saturdays and work the draws with my Tom." The boy thought about that. "He won't like it." "No," she said. "He won't." And she filled the sack. Then came a man from the far section nobody knew well. Cracked lips, 3 days of beard with the frost still in it. No pride left on him to spend. He didn't talk around it the way Lavinia had. He just said, "Ma'am, I got a wife, and I got nothing to burn, and I heard you did." That was the whole speech. Bridget liked him better for it than most. She sent him home with as much as his one arm could carry and told him to bring a sledge next time. And then, before the winter let go, came the Reeds. Not Amos himself, he sent his wife, the way a proud man does. Della Reed stood in the yard with a good wool shawl and a face that didn't want to be there. She didn't say much. Amos would have come, she started, and then didn't finish it, because they both knew he wouldn't have. The man who'd said Bridget would feed her children out of the same hand she gathered dung with had run his modern store down to bare boards, and he'd sent his wife down the road to fill a basket out of the widow's monument to muck. Bridget filled it, said nothing about the store, didn't ask after Amos. But Tom, watching from the woodblock, saw his mother's jaw go tight the second Della Reed said the name, and stay tight the whole time the woman stood in the yard, and stay that way a good while after she'd gone. He knew better than to say anything about it. He'd seen that jaw before. The lean-to packed to feed one family was feeding half a dozen now. And the thing not one of them could have explained, standing there warm with a full basket, was the simplest thing of all. Why hers? Why the widow they'd all stepped around had a whole winter's heat stacked out in the open, while the modern county froze? The answer had been under their boots the entire time. They just wouldn't stoop for it. So here's why the widow had heat when the county didn't. Comes down to two plain things. Neither one is clever. First one is that the fuel was already there. A cow on grass drops what a cow drops. And out on that range, there were more cattle than a man could count. Dry it in the sun, and a chip is mostly the same stuff that was in the grass to start with. The fiber, the part that burns. It had been lying in those draws every summer since the first herd crossed the river. Bridget didn't find something nobody else had. She picked up something everybody else walked past. Fuel that cost nothing and came back every summer on its own, lying in the open for anyone who'd bend. Set against a bin of coal that cost real money and rode in on a train that could stop dead. Put like that, it's not much of a contest. It only looked like one because of the smell. The second thing is the part the sneering families would have gotten wrong even if they'd tried it. Dry. A chip is only fuel if it's dry all the way through. Damp, it smokes and dies on you. Frozen with the wet still in it, worse than useless. The whole trick, the only trick there is in the timing. You gather in the long dry heat of summer, you cure it hard, and you stack it up off the ground and under a roof where the snow can't get at it. Bridget's edge over that whole county wasn't a method anybody could have patented. It was that she'd done the work in July for a fire she wouldn't strike a match to until January. Every last family on that road could have done exactly what she did. The chips were free and lying in plain sight from the road. What stopped them wasn't knowing, and it wasn't money. It was that bending down for it felt like admitting something about how far you'd come, or hadn't. Bridget had admitted it years before, standing over a fresh grave with a claim she had no way to heat. She'd made her peace with the smell a long time back. It cost her, though. That part doesn't go in the tidy version. By February, the lean-to was near swept, and there were still baskets coming to the door. So Bridget did the thing she'd sworn she wouldn't. She started burning the poor chips, the ones she'd stacked before they cured, the ones that smoked and stunk up the house for real this time. Because a smoking fire is still a fire, and a child still needs the room warm. The place smelled of it for weeks after. She never once threw the smell back at the people warming their hands at her stove. People argued for years about that winter. Not about whether it was bad, about how bad. Nobody on those farms kept an instrument that could read the worst of it. And the figures that come down to us were mostly written in later, from memory, which is its own kind of weather. So we don't have a number for the coldest night. What we have is the other things people remembered. The 9-day blizzard that came in the first week of February and didn't quit. So that a man who stepped out to the barn tied a rope to the door and paid it out behind him. The creek frozen so hard a loaded wagon crossed it in March and left no mark. Green wood that wouldn't catch. Wet skin that stuck to an iron pump handle and came away leaving something behind. The paper, when it finally came through again, called it the hardest stretch since the river first froze bank to bank. That's the closest thing to a measurement we've got. Later accounts put some nights near 30 below. Maybe. Nobody out there was writing it down. They were feeding stoves and keeping children breathing, and a thermometer wasn't the tool that mattered that week. What we do know is what the smoke told. By the middle of February, you could have walked that road, chimney to chimney, and counted the dead stoves on your 2 hands and run out of hands. Bridget's was the one still putting up a straight gray line, morning and night. They'd stopped talking about the cold entirely. They were talking about her. The coal train got through in the last week of March. People walked down to the depot to watch it come in, the way you'd go look at a thing you'd half quit believing in. It brought coal and lamp oil and the ordinary world riding in behind. Inside a week, you could buy a ton off Amos Reed again and tell yourself, if you had the stomach for it, that the whole winter had happened to somebody else. But you can't tell yourself that. Not on a road that short. Everybody knew whose shed had carried them to spring. Nobody stood up and made a speech. It wasn't a speech-making kind of place. But the thanks came out the way it does out there. In work. In things left in the yard with nobody standing next to them. Somebody mended the sag in Bridget's lean-to roof while she was off in town. The Hart's oldest boy kept coming all spring to work the draws, and after a while, nobody had to send for him. And when Amos Reed passed her on the road that April, he took his hat off, which he had never in his life done for her, and he said the nearest thing to sorry a man like that has in him. "I had coal to sell," he said. "I'll not hold it against a woman who had something better laid by." Bridget nodded at him and went on down the road. It was as far as either one of them could go, and it was far enough. By the next fall, if you'd walked that road at the tail end of a dry spell, you'd have seen a thing that hadn't been there the year before. Chips curing in the sun behind one house after another, lean-tos going up, roofed against the rain. The same families who'd held their noses laying in prairie coal by the sackload, and quiet about it now. Bridget never said much about that either. She'd learned it bent over in a pasture beside her mother a long time before. She passed it to Nell the same way, and the girl's chest got stronger as she grew into it, and the lean-to was never once empty in January again. There was one more thing about that first hard winter the county never quite squared up. Bridget had started laying in fuel back in August, weeks before the first flake fell, while the almanac was still promising mild. She'd known, not guessed, known. And not one of them ever thought to ask how a widow with no almanac and no instrument in the house had read a winter that the whole modern world got wrong. That one wasn't about chips at all. It was about what she'd taught herself to watch for, out there, on the days everybody else called fine. If her stove kept you warm this far, leave a like before you go, and follow for that one. It's coming, but that's a story for another night.